Okay, so hi everybody. Today we have Brandon Kilbourne with us, who is a biologist and poet living in Berlin, Germany. Hence why we're doing this a little earlier, our time today. He's earned his PhD in evolutionary biology at the University of Chicago in 2011 and was specializing in functional morphology. And he now works at the Natural History Museum in Berlin. And so since publishing his first poem in 2018, his work has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize by Ecotone and has appeared in so many different journals, including Poet Lore, Ecotone, Tahoma Literary Review, Obsidian, West Trade Review, Santa Fe Literary Review, The Fourth River, Artemis, Slant, Catamaran Literary Reader, and so many more, even in other languages. His work has been translated into, such as Estonian. So yeah, we are super lucky to have him here today to be talking about science poetry. And so with that, I will leave it up to you, Brandon. Thank you so much.
Sure, let me share my screen. Huh. Let's see, there's a bit of an issue here. I think to share my screen. Um,
Does it say that you don't have access?
it says I have to open system preferences.
Hmm.
Let's see, I'm not really sure.
You can also share it with me and I can move through the slides if that's easier.
Okay. Yeah, maybe what I can do is share the PowerPoint
Mm,
in the chat.
Sounds good. Strange. Mm. Hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a problem on our end, like being a host or if Zoom. Um, but yeah, I can open this up and then, yeah, just let me know when to switch slides and we'll go over
Sure,
it
that'll
here.
work.
And yeah, okay, cool. So I'm opening it and sharing.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, you just go to the next slide.
Wait. Oh shoot. Oh yeah. Okay. Cool. So
Yeah, that works. Yeah, so I want to start off with a quote from a very long poem that I think really kind of gets at the possible link between science and poetry. And so this is sort of an excerpt from a poem by William Carlos Williams called Asphodel, That Greeny Flower. And so my heart rouses, thinking to bring you news of something that concerns you and concerns many men. Look at what passes for the new. You will not find it there, but in despised poems. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. And so if you can go to the next slide, or really the next two slides, I have some passages here within this excerpt that I think are really crucial. And it's the idea of the new. And what role does the new play in our lives? So my heart rouses, so this excitement, thinking to bring you news. But then also, this sense of newness is something that fulfills us. So it is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. And so it's not the issue of dying, it's something about the quality of human existence, human life, that benefits from poems. So there's this idea of newness. And then if you can go to the next slide, here's a quote from the poet Jane Hirschfield, so a very prominent poet and sort of theoretician of poetry. And the quote is, "Poetry's work is the clarification and magnification of being." And if you can go to the next slide, or really two slides, I guess. What's really crucial here is this idea of clarification and magnification. And so this is how I sort of see the link between science and poetry. Science is trying to show us insights and sort of a newness to the natural world. We're trying to learn about the natural world's existence and sort of its patterns, its processes, and its order. And we're doing this through clarification and magnification. And so you could think of, say, an hypothesis tested, refuted, or say not refuted, is a sense of clarification of the natural world. And then what's often critical to this clarification is a magnification using techniques such as CT scanning or mass electron microscopy or something like this. But with poetry, doing something slightly different, right? It's very different in a way. We're really looking at what is new, or trying to find the new, make things new in terms of human existence and our time on this planet. And within a poem, say a strong poem, we're trying to clarify, what does this mean to be alive on this planet? What does it mean for human existence? Or in some cases, say a perspective of non-human existence. If you want to look at ourselves or look at, say, the situation of an animal or a non-human entity. And also magnification of sort of these experiences of what it means to be alive on this planet. So that's where I see the similarities between science and poetry. And if you can go to the next slide, please. To sort of jump into this, as in science, there are certain tools we have. So I mentioned, CT scanning or microscopy, using calipers, using pH test. There are several tools we use to learn about the world and try to understand the world. And in poetry, there are a set of tools we also use. And so if you go to the next slide, please. So this is like a very long list of things, and it's, for one, nowhere near exhaustive. But we can use things such as the music or sounds of poetry to sort of engage with the reader. We can use rhymes, also part of sound. We can use imagery. We can use tropes such as metaphors, similes. We can use meter and rhythm, form, the way we contrast objects or aspects of images and poems. The question of the voice, the speaker, who's being addressed. Also silence. We can also play with language itself, such as using, say, more Germanic rooted words, or say more Latinate words. And then one thing I'll be talking about in particular is what's called the volta, or the turn, which is a way to try to give, I guess, that little shock of newness within the poem. And then one of the things to say about the poem as a whole, that usually, even if it's, say, a longer work, there is this sort of concentration and attentiveness that goes to the subject matter within the poem. And oftentimes, say, for particularly lyric poems, the poems dealing with, say, the emotions, the reactions, these are very compressed poems. And that sort of compression of experience within the poem is one way to heighten the newness. And so I want to give you a few examples of some of these tools. And so the poems I gave you, I'm going to sort of point out a few of these tools in these poems. But here's one poem that's not actually in the collection I gave you. So this is not a science poem. This is more definitely a religious poem, which is a bit odd because I'm actually not a religious person. But when I think of the sounds of poems, and sound in poetry and what that can do to really engage with the reader. This is the prime example that always springs first to my mind. And this is called God's Grandeur by Gerard Manley Hopkins. And so I'll read it aloud, and I'd like you to try to hear the sound or pay attention to the sound. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, have trod, have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness, deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, oh, morning, at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods, with warm breast and with bright wings. And so sound is a real tool in this poem to engage with the reader, to sort of get them sort of in the mood of this poem, sort of pull them in, draw them into this poem, and really see what the author is trying to say, kind of what's at stake for the poem. So if we can get to the next slide. So here are the tools of poems again, but we can also, I think one thing to keep in mind about poems is that we kind of have three central questions that I guess we always try to approach a poem with from the very beginning. And that is, who is speaking, who is being addressed, and why is this, being put out there? What does the author want us to get from this? So kind of what end or what's at stake, or there's different ways to phrase that question. And really these tools I have to the left here are ways to try to draw someone in to that end. And so next slide. So within this broader world of poetry, there's, I think, going to be a particular challenge to combine science and poetry. And that is, in science, we definitely have, say, bigger, more complex ideas, just generally speaking. We have facts, we have concepts, we have jargon, kind of sort of insiders language, insiders concepts that for non-experts, probably the readers of our poems, they're not going to know these things. And so the question is, to write the effective science poem, do we try to incorporate these things, or do we not incorporate some of these things? And so it becomes a question of necessity. And I can try to give you a little anecdote here of kind of what I'm talking about. A lot of my poems deal with the natural world. And so I had one poem in particular about wildebeest, of all things. And I was workshopping the poem, and there's a thing about excluding myself and the instructor, maybe about 10 people. And during a workshop, usually you're silent while they were critiquing your poem. And at some point, someone said, well, at what time point in history is this poem taking place? He said, well, this seems to be prehistoric times because wildebeest don't exist anymore. And then the other half of the group said, no, wildebeest do exist. They're still alive today. And so this is kind of a thing where something simple as, do wildebeest exist? That's not on everyone's radar. And that doesn't mean that the people in the workshop are dumb or uneducated. That's just not part of their education. That's just not part of their daily life. And so it becomes the question of, when we try to communicate science, how do we communicate it in a poem that non-expert readers can understand what we're talking about? And this is, I would say, much easier said than done a lot of the times. So that's kind of the special challenge I see um, with trying to bring science into poetry. So next slide. So yeah, so I'll be talking about some tools today in the poems I'll share with you. Particularly, so we already kind of went over like the music of poetry. Um, I'll talk about imagery, metaphor and simile, form, and in particular juxtaposition and turn. And can you hit the next slide? And so I guess one of the things as we go through a few examples, and also when you look at sort of the broader swath of poems I sent you, is you can ask the question of what exactly is a science poem in the first place? And I don't think there's a simple answer to that in a way, because when you think of poetry in general, that's a very hard question to answer. Like, what exactly is or is not a poem? Because poems take so many forms, they do so many things. It just is a real range of an art form that is not really at all pigeonholed. And so let's go to the first poem. And yeah, I've been speaking a lot, so it'd be great if someone could actually read this for the rest of us.
Okay, I can do this one, but someone has to volunteer for the next. Okay, so When I Heard the Learned Astronomer by Walt Whitman. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were arranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars.
Thanks. So yeah, I mean, workshops usually work, especially when we're kind of collectively going over poems, but everyone is kind of, you know, jumping in and commenting and just kind of saying how they reacted to this poem. So I'm kind of curious, like, what do you guys think about this? Or what do you see in terms of the form of the poem, kind of the imagery in the poem? Is it changing? Is it not changing? Um, what is the reaction to this? So we have one comment from James. It gives off impenetrable conference talk vibes.
Yeah, if I could elaborate on that real fast.
Sure, sure. We have
I'm
time.
a yeah, I'm a mathematician, so this whole idea of like, being in a lecture room with a bunch of talks going on where people are talking about maybe super abstract things that maybe are going over most people's heads. And then at the end of it, there's still a bunch of applause, and you leave maybe getting something out of it, but not quite sure what. Um, and then kind of returning to the rest of your day where you're like, huh, I'm outside again. Or I don't know. That's sort of what I got from it.
I mean, that's definitely a big part of this poem. Um, no, you definitely hit a big aspect of it right on the head. Um, what else do you or anyone else notice about the poem?
At least for me, like, I feel like this poem gets at this, like, aspect of being a scientist where you are like looking at these figures and you're looking at indirect measures of things, and like you're getting abstracted further and further from like the thing that you think is beautiful. And so then like that part in the end where it's like, okay, once all these abstractions we've like applauded over, now like I go outside and like look into the sky and like are background into like what inspires you maybe as a scientist.
Yeah.
To kind of build off of what Jess just said, I did notice that the first half of the poem begins really similarly structurally with the word when. And then that kind of reminds me of this like really repetitive nature of doing science. I'm doing my experiment over and over again to get to my sample size, doing the same thing, writing endlessly. And then kind of halfway through, as you're getting out of the process of doing science and really, as Jess said, like stepping out of that academic world and just appreciating the thing that you are studying because there's a reason why you love it.
Yeah. I mean, one thing to, oh, we have a comment from James.
Yes, and from Carl.
So James' comment is, the turn happens right at the end of the fourth line at the halfway point and allows the reader a space to identify with the speaker. And that's exactly it. Like, I think that's to me where the turn comes. So it's a shift from these four wins, these four lines beginning with win, that are really in the lecture hall. And then between 4 and 5, there's this shift where we're kind of going from the focus of the lecturer to really the feelings of the speaker, the physical feelings, or maybe emotionally tired as well, of the speaker. And one thing I can point out here is that if you look at the form of the poem, and I guess what's nice about PowerPoint is that we can have the full line written out, because in most books, those lines are a bit compressed, kind of running over a bit, if you know what I mean. But you can see from lines really 2 to 4, these are getting very long. And in a way, like you just look at the slide, they look kind of tedious because they're just so long. And then with the turn in line 5, it becomes short again. And so the form of the poem is really short, like in a way, kind of enacting this sort of monotony or this sort of, labor of, having to sit through these lectures. And so this, like everything, all the comments I made, I think are really right on the money. Between like the repetitive of the win, the abstraction versus the direct observation, the turn. And I think this is all highlighted by the structure of the poem and how Walt Whitman uses the line lengths to convey this sort of overabundance of just facts, I guess you could say, or having to sit through this lecture, this impenetrable conference talk. So I think this is a good example of the turn and form. And then also this, like I said, juxtaposition. So on one hand, we're contrasting sort of the conference talk vibe with the actual direct experience vibe of just being out there and observing and witnessing, being in the moment. So yeah, that's how I see this poem. Yeah. So here's another poem that was in the handout I gave you. And this is a very different poem. And I'm hoping that the poems I shared with you can give you a range of poems to experience. So who would want to read this one out? Well, actually, let me say something first about Miroslav Holub. So Miroslav Holub was an actual scientist. He was an immunologist. I don't know exactly, his greatest discoveries, but he was apparently a very prominent immunologist in the Czech Republic. And he was also a poet, and he's interesting. Some of his poems are very roundabout, where I would say, given, he was alive during the Cold War in communist, then Czechoslovakia. So some of the things he wrote kind of did try to get around censors, and there's almost this kind of, I would say in some of his poems, it's really kind of unsparing, kind of very direct language, in my opinion. So let's just say a little bit about the author. So who would care to read this one? Okay, go for it, James.
Encyclopedia, sum of all knowledge. A giant brown and white bull, suspended on chains by his dislocated hind leg, its prolapsed belly contracted in spasm, is dragged with its twitching mouth along the ground and slowly butchered over a leaky sump. The giant eye, protruded, is turning inward, where some fingernail ceaselessly gropes to discover what is beta glucuronidase.
Cool, thanks. And just to go quickly, can you go one slide over? So here it is in Czech, and you can see that the structure, which is like the line lengths, the size of the stanzas, is more or less the same as it is in English. Just to show you that, because sometimes in translation, things really do change just by the whims of the translator. And whoops. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, but getting back to the English translation, what do you guys think?
I mean, it really gets at this, I think, problem in nature of like the lengths, or in science, of the lengths will go to like discover, and like the destruction involved in the process of discovery. That's what I read from it.
Okay. Anyone else?
Building off of what Jess said, I found it really interesting that it's called like encyclopedia, sum of all knowledge, but then the only really scientific part is right at the very end. The vast majority of it is dedicated to this like gory graphic imagery.
Okay.
I think
Any other one? Go ahead.
I think going to the title, maybe it's a reference to how, I guess there's so much that we haven't uncovered, and even something as like, I mean, I don't know, I don't want to say like mundane, because this is not a mundane image, but it's like it's a carcass, something that is, it's a dead thing, but yet there's still so much we can learn from it. So I think it's like kind of maybe saying that the living system itself is an encyclopedia. It's a sum of everything that we know and that we have yet to discover.
Okay. Are there any other comments?
Kind of going off of what Claire said, actually, there's a sense that like there was that comment that like the only scientific part seems to come at the end, but I don't know. I might say like the whole thing is part of the science. The whole thing is to get at the beta glucuronidase at the end. Like there's this whole gory kind of violent mess, and that's what it's for, right? It's not to eat the bull. It doesn't seem that the bull is going to be eaten or used for anything else. It's for that. So it's somehow a part of that and inseparable from that, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I don't know if there's a single right answer to kind of the question, what is this about? But what you guys are saying, I also feel that too. And I mean, I find the title very interesting. Like the sum of all knowledge. Well, I mean, I guess to even step back, like one of the things when I read this poem, I kind of wonder, there's someone speaking, there's an entity speaking, but you didn't have any sense of who or what this is speaking. There's kind of an objective narrator. And you don't really know who they're speaking to. Again, like it's maybe just sort of almost chronicling what's happening. So this kind of aloofness or this distance to what's being said here. And I also kind of wonder myself, is this whole thing a metaphor? Is it really just like an observation of what is happening to this bull? Or is there also somehow a metaphor happening at the same time? And one of the things I find interesting about the title is the sum of all knowledge. And so I think in some ways, a sum can also be kind of like the final crux of a bigger situation. Kind of what does it all come down to? And if you look at the structure of the poem, you can kind of see it's tapering. I mean, there's some variation in the line lengths, but it's kind of tapering down to that final line. So it's kind of come down to the sum of this beta glucuronidase. And so we have this very violent, jarring, really brutal imagery that just kind of narrows down, sums down to this abstraction. And so I would say like the turn for me in this poem is really the last line. Because I guess when I look at this, there's also kind of, I know that being a biologist, the suffix "ase" denotes an enzyme. But I'm wondering for the, like say the non-expert, non-biologist reader, would they get that? And I kind of put myself in their shoes. We have this very violent imagery, kind of savage imagery, that just tapers down to an abstraction in the end. And so I think that that's a very crucial choice in how to end this poem and how to sort of make it an effective poem. And one of the other things I can point out, I mean, one of the things about the form of the poem as well that I find really, really apt, just kind of really on point, is that sort of, let's see, sixth line, is dragged with his twitching mouth along the ground, where that line is longer than all the rest. So that line itself is almost dragging the animal along the ground by choosing to have that long line there. So that's the thing, this poem has a turn. It's playing with like the sort of like tapering form. In the part of the poem where the animal is being dragged, the line itself drags itself out. So I think there's a lot happening in this kind of short, compressed poem. I took a lot of notes here. Let's see. And I guess the other thing I'd say is, to me, there's a little bit of music in that first stanza, like brown bull, giant, white. His dislocated, his hind, low as in located, low leg, lapsed belly, contracted, so tract spaz. So I hear in this first stanza some sort of light, say, music, but that kind of really disappears as you go down to the sum of the poem, so to speak. And yeah, I don't know. That's kind of what I'm also seeing here, in addition to what you guys have said. And I guess for me, this is such a jarring ending to the poem. And again, trying to put myself in the shoes of someone who's not a biologist reading this. It's such a jarring ending. It kind of makes me wonder if this knowledge is so abstract, this final product, or what is learned is so abstract. But at the same time, the image of the violence and the image of what's done to the bull is so vivid, you know, it kind of raises the question, is the knowledge worth it, almost, to me. Because that final bit of glucuronidase is just kind of, I would say, incomprehensible if you're not a biochemist, basically. So I don't know, there's a lot, I think, in this poem. And as some people said, well, someone said, maybe, you know, it's about the mystery of the living body, there's so much to learn. I think that's absolutely one interpretation of this. But that's the thing, I think in this poem, there are many ways to approach it, and there's many ways to engage with it. And I think it speaks to so many different questions, different perspectives. Yeah, I think there's really a lot in this sort of compressed poem.
Brennan, can I ask you a question about jargon in poetry?
Yeah,
Yeah, I think in this case, this is like the perfect use of jargon, like literally just there to be like, you know, this exclusionary, like the fact that like this knowledge is only worth it to the people that understand what this word means. Right. So I'm
yeah.
curious, like, yeah, are there any other situations in poems that you think jargon is actually like useful to include?
There must be poems out there. I mean, so we're talking about scientific jargon here. This is the only poem that really just jumps to my mind immediately.
Mhm.
But where I kind of feel get a similar vibe at times is with poems that are sort of lampooning advertising. And they're using these very like trite, marketable, like ad phrases, right? And so that's something different, but it's using this sort of niche language to get at a point.
Mhm.
And yeah, so that's kind of where I got a similar vibe. I get a similar vibe, but used in a very different way.
Mhm. Cool. Thank you.
Sure. I don't know. Does anyone else have anything to say about this poem in particular? Okay, I guess we can just go to the go over to the next poem. So this is one of my own poems, and this one has an opening note. And so I said, you know, earlier, how do you communicate the science within a science poem? Um, if you decide to really pursue science poems, the idea of the opening note, I think, is when if you start submitting work to journals, some editors don't mind them and find them nice. Other editors do not like them at all. So it's, I guess, it to be a bit judicious about when you use an opening note. And so in this case, the poem was inspired by the main dinosaur in Berlin's dinosaur hall. So that's the dinosaur here in the picture. Called Giraffatitan bronchi, used to be called Brachiosaurus bronchi. So it's one of these large, long-necked sauropod dinosaurs. And what I guess inspired the poem for me is, you know, here we have this large African dinosaur in Berlin, you know, taken from a former colony. It's here in Berlin. And by coincidence, Berlin is also where the Berlin Conference happened. So this is also called the Congo Conference. So when the colonial powers came together to decide who gets what part of Africa, by basically carving up Africa like a turkey, or a carcass going to a slaughterhouse, that's where they did this. They did this in Berlin. So Berlin is the city of this conference that has really bad consequences for to put it very mildly, a huge understatement, really bad consequences for the African continent and its people, but also the site of this dinosaur that is itself a colonial specimen. And so that's kind of the background for the poem. And yeah, just to get into it, I guess maybe because it's my poem, maybe I should just read this one. So, the giraffe titan. At the feet of a precipice tall skeleton, we wonder about the horrors of the Jurassic. Predators stalking, then slicing into their prey. Walking among Berlin's exhibited bones, embodying bridge-span necks and column limbs, lance-point armor and knife-line jaws. We try to picture a world beyond our kin. Subject to claws evolved as killing personified. Laws of unremitting savagery. Imagine on an over-muggy earth, a head towering above in the domain of treetops and dogfighting pterosaurs. Imagine the head-crowned neck crashing down like a felled alder, the impact thundering as if a deposed god was hurled to earth. In final moments, would the aged titan be able to imagine scavengers biting into its cold skin, its bones swallowed by tidal mud? Could it then possibly imagine a world beyond its kin, hundreds of thousands of millennia later, in which 20 men in Berlin would carve its continent into plantations, mines, and ivory hunting grounds? Their talents manifest in massacres, charring within burning villages. Famine's gaunt ribs slowly quelling rebellions. Black skin in the mouths of ravenous empires. Even if so, why try wondering at all? A predator is a predator after all, regardless of the time in Earth's history. They simply differ in their habit and the hunt. Some sink their own teeth into a scaly hide, a roar professing their territory. Others convene over a landmass map, howling false claims in English, French, and German. So what are your reactions to this? And don't be afraid to hold back or say something critical.
I thought this one was really cool when I read it earlier, and I really liked hearing you read it because it definitely, I always struggle when I'm reading poems to like pace correctly. So actually hearing you read your own poem made it like hit different, I guess. But I love the different comparison with the our Ken and then its Ken, and like trying to go from these two different millennia apart time periods, and then how it sort of comes together at the end where it's like a predator is a predator, but yet it doesn't like hit the same for me. Like even at the end, a predator is a predator after all, but then the descriptions, I guess the dinosaur description, the sink their teeth into a scaly hide, is somehow more familiar to me compared to like the other horror of like colonialization, which is not taught to elementary school students like dinosaurs are. So I really liked it.
Nice.
I really like how in this poem you're trying to draw some similarities here, obviously, between these two ideas of colonialism as well as the dinosaur here. And I think also too, in that drawing the similarities between the two, it also makes, at least for me, reading and hearing this poem wonder about the differences too. Like one I feel like is good in the sense of like a dinosaur, eating other dinosaurs. I'm okay with that. That sits well with me. But the other part that's drawing similarities to it, the colonialism, doesn't sit well with me. This idea of Europe carving up Africa, is kind of has a sour taste in my mouth. So I think it's really interesting how it draws similarities, but also makes us think of the differences between the two situations.
Kind of in that vein, I think my favorite line is a predator is a predator, because just a simple, I guess, quote unquote, simple statement like that invites the reader to ask, well, is a predator, right? Like, who am I going to learn in school was a predator, a predatory dinosaur, or old colonial rulers dividing up a continent, right? Like, who gets to, who do we classify traditionally as a predator, as somebody who preys on others? And also, poetry is, I think, my one of my bigger hobbies, and I've done that sort of thing before, of saying a thing is a thing. So I just I just sort of recognize something I've tried to do before. I really appreciate that technique of repetition.
Thanks. Yeah, you guys have really, I think, hit all of it. Yeah, this poem, yeah, definitely there's the turning, as you guys have noted, going from the Mesozoic into colonial Africa. And sort of that juxtaposition between the two. So I mean, there's a turning, but also this juxtaposition between these two, say, predatory, savage worlds, where I think the depiction of the Mesozoic is not so savage, maybe until the very end, where I talk about sinking teeth into a hide. That gets savage, but before that, the Mesozoic's depiction is kind of pastoral compared to the colonial depiction. Yeah, I mean, I try to have some musicality to the poem. So like we wonder, like wonder, horror, Jurassic. So sort of some like kind of half rhymes at the syllable level within that second line. Stalking, slicing, predator, prey, walking among Berlin's exhibited bones. And so that, I think, to try to draw the reader in a bit more. This is sort of my style of writing. And then, yeah, I guess really the heart of this poem for me is the juxtaposition. And I think, James, you really hit, I guess, what's the crucial line for me as a writer, like on the head, like a predator is a predator after all, regardless, and kind of all that implies about, who gets to decide what is a predator and what is not a predator, how is this taught in schools? Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the crux of the poem. And then I guess I mentioned a little bit about like science facts and like what do you have in there? So there's one small fact I kind of ignored because I don't think the average reader would get it. And so, kind of a paleontology background, most paleontologists, I guess, now think dinosaurs didn't really roar. They more likely hissed. And that's the thing, like, a hiss professing their territory, I think the average reader would be like, why hissing? Is it a snake all of a sudden? Like, so that's the thing. I think it's a small detail, but I think it's an example of, yeah, we want to convey the science in the poem, but sometimes maybe some facts are so obscure that no one's going to know what you're talking about. And so I guess it do a little bit use your judgment and how to like incorporate facts into a poem. And then also, I guess it's the question of, if you fudge this aspect of the science, or is it going to really like detract from the whole poem, or kind of what you're trying to say in the poem? And that's a very hard thing, I think, to figure out. I mean, this is like a very small example, but I guess there'll be bigger examples as you guys write your poems. Yeah, so that's about it, I guess. I'm trying to think. And so that's the thing with these poems, I would say, trying to go back, you know, this poem is a really historical poem. Like, it's about history, it's about geopolitical events, but it's still called a science poem. You know, Walt Whitman's When I Heard Learned Astronomer, that's a poem that's about the feeling of being in the lecture hall and having these abstractions versus the feeling of seeing the world and nature, the natural world firsthand. You know, so it's kind of like direct experience, kind of lived experience kind of poem. Then we have Holub's Encyclopedia, the Sum of All Knowledge, where maybe in the poem there's a giant metaphor and the speaker in the poem is very detached, kind of very aloof from the poem itself in a way, the events of the poem. And so this kind of bird's eye view of what's happening in that poem. And so I would say these are all science poems, but they're all doing very different things. And so I hope it kind of conveys that with a science poem, kind of your possibilities are a little bit limitless, I guess, in a way. You know, you can do a lot of things and try a lot of experiments, a lot of, you know, really finding your own voice within science poems. And so, yeah, I hope this has been like a helpful overview. And we have 6 minutes left. So I don't know if you guys want to go over some of the other poems in the handout, or like quickly, or if there's one that stood out to you that you like to try discussing or whatnot.
Thank you, Brandon. While people are thinking of questions, I think, yeah, like it's so interesting to see the theme of what it seems like what science poetry can do is allow you to talk about the stuff that doesn't make its way into the like objective scientific papers, right? But that is always like the background of science, right? Like the destruction that we have to do to like get knowledge, the colonialism, all those things. So I guess, yeah, it seems like that's like a really big benefit of poetry is like adding that subjectivity and the context around science.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. Because I think, you know, we have this sort of objective reporting of hypotheses, the stats, you know, just the sort of the nuts and bolts of the science itself. But the thing about poetry is, it kind of mentions about human experience, and as scientists are all human, right? So there's this kind of backdrop to science that's usually not discussed. Which is kind of behind the scenes in a way. And poetry, like you said, is a really way to try to like bring that to the forefront and engage with that and kind of share that with the world in various aspects.
Yeah, it's really cool and unique in that way. Any questions? Follow-ups?
I just kind of had a question. I know that when you were listing your like or tools that poetry uses, you were like free verse or a sonnet, but I don't see many sonnets that are about science in this list.
Yeah,
so
well,
what are
that was
your
the,
thoughts on like free verse structure versus those more structured forms?
yeah, that's a good question. So I just had those two as just random examples. I mean, there's other forms besides the sonnet. But yeah, but more broadly, I have written in meter. I have tried, I guess not a sonnet, but writing in form. It's for me hard. I mean, in some ways I like it because it's a challenge, but especially if you're writing in meter, that's like, you know, the stress on stress, you know, kind of patterns, and it's hard. I guess if you're gonna have a strict meter, it gets hard. If you're gonna have a loose meter where you're not so uptight about it, it's a bit easier. But it can force you to like interesting word choices, like interesting diction, that maybe you wouldn't go otherwise. But I think for me personally, writing in some kind of form, maybe it does push you in different directions, but I think it can also kind of handcuff you. It just depends on the poem. And having free verse, I think you do have a lot more freedom. But the one thing I would say, I think really critical that took me a while to learn for all writing all kinds of poems, whether it's form, whether it's free verse, is that you have to have an internal logic to the poem. Like your choice of diction at one part of the poem should be influenced, maybe not always, but it should, consider the diction at other parts of the poem. And the thing is, like, if you have a too big a jump in imagery, maybe sometimes you'll lose the reader. If you have, this great phrase in your head that sounds so cool, but the rest of the poem is kind of doing something different, is not going to work. Like you will lose the reader. And so I think that's the hardest lesson to learn, whether you're writing in free verse or whether you're writing in form. It's kind of like, how you stitch the poem together. So it's really cohesive. So it's not so much maybe drawing imagery or drawing diction. It's just kind of, you have to step back from the poem and see, is it cohesive? Does it all make sense? Does it all come really together? And that's something, I think I would still say I'm struggling with. I think if I had to guess, a lot of poets, even more advanced poets, struggle with that, because that's kind of the hard part, I think, of a poem. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? I know that we don't have much time, but a lot of students are wondering like how people go about balancing like this artistic endeavors that you have with your scientific career. Like, how has your experience been like going into like publishing poetry and that whole, yeah.
It's hard. I would say the hard part, I mean, one is writing the poems. But two, I mean, writing the first draft is hard enough. Two, odds are you're not going to get something published the first time you submit it. So you're going to have to revise and get comfortable with revising. And that takes a lot of time, and that takes a lot of attention, because I think to really write a successful poem, it takes an incredible amount of concentration and attention. It's not just like sitting there, putting out brain waves, you know what I mean? But it's in your head, and it might be, I don't know, on the bus, you might be walking down the street, you might be in the lab, but somehow in the back of your brain, even if you're not consciously thinking about it, it's there. And so it does take a lot of your kind of brain energy. The other side is publishing. So I'm going to guess probably you guys are not going to be at MFA programs. So you're not going to have that kind of network of people. So finding journals that will take your work. So that's the thing, like all journals are not going to take all work. Some journals are more niche, some journals will say have a particular flavor of poetry they like and these sorts of things. So it takes work to figure that out. Like, what style of writing does the journal like? And so you have to read journals, you have to like look for samples online at your library. And that, I think, takes more work than you might realize. And then, yeah, I mean, that I think is kind of the crux of it. And how do you balance that with your actual science? I'll just say it's not easy. It's really, yeah. I don't know. I mean, you might say, okay, what I do try is like, okay, I'll try to take one day on the weekend for my poetry. And I try to take maybe an hour, maybe hour and a half, a night for poetry, kind of before I'm going to bed, because like my last thing to do to wind down. But then again, to warn you, I've also had situations where I kind of hit a good stride, and then it's like 2 a.m, and I had to wake up in the next morning. So it's yeah, it's not an easy thing to balance.
Yeah, and I imagine also, like, since you're so critical of science sometimes, or its colonial roots in your poetry, like, do people ever like are they ever antagonistic about that, or like are upset about you bringing that up, or like do you have to like deal with anything the emotional side of it?
I've never had anyone come up to me and say like, "Why did you write that?" or "Why?" I mean, if I'm just going to be honest and I had to guess, I mean, since this is dealing with the issue of race, I think people who are critical probably don't want to go there. um, you know, so yeah, I think that's might be part of it. But the people who like come up to me and like approach me about the work, they like it. Um, and so that's a big encouraging because I think, yeah, having people who kind of feel this is a time to talk about these topics and get into these topics. I don't know. I think when you're a writer, when you're a poet, or just even a novelist or short story writer, like that urge to write is coming from you, right? But to have people come, it's like the same as science. Like the urge to do it is coming from you. But when you engage with a colleague, like, oh, I really like what you did in this study. Really like this or this and this. It is a bit rewarding. It does give you an extra push to kind of keep going. That people are out there feeling what you're doing. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's the thing. I don't know. I've never really encountered criticism yet so far, or any scoffing or anything like that. I mean, the closest I've come to that is I was one time at a science event. Let's just call it that, at an institution. Won't name names, and I had a Walt Whitman T-shirt on, and one of the senior scientists there was like, "Who's that on your shirt?" It was Walt Whitman. She's like, "Well, who is he? Like, what did he discover?" I'm like, "Well, he didn't discover anything. He's a poet." And she just had this look of shock on her face, like disgust, just like, "A poet, and you wear him on your breast?" And like really like shook her head and like just could not fathom why I would have this shirt on. And there are two other senior scientists like locally next to me, and they're like, "Yes, he's wearing Walt Whitman because Walt Whitman's amazing." And they just kind of went in this whole thing about how Walt Whitman's cool. And she just kind of backed down. She's like, "Oh, well, I didn't know." And it's like, "Oh, okay." So I don't know. I mean, that's kind of, I guess, the negative I've had about it. So it's not so much the topic I'm writing about, but maybe just poetry itself. Like I do remember also the time when I told colleagues for the first time here at the museum, I'm writing poems. Like we're out having beers on a Friday, and you just hear the record skip, and the crickets start chirping, and it was like long silence. Like, "Oh, so what do you write about?" And it's like, "Oh, okay." So I guess the thing, like, it's more the issue of being a poet in the first place, as opposed to what I'm actually writing about.
So true. Had similar experiences. Anyways, I won't keep us any longer unless everyone's okay with it. But if there's no other questions, we can thank Brandon for being here. This has been really insightful and great. And hopefully some of us will write some poems and we can share them with you, Brandon.
Oh,
We can see
absolutely,
how.
absolutely.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, everyone.
No, thank you for your attention and the invitation.